So I watched One Battle After Another the other day, and I have some thoughts about it. First of all, let me apologize for my voice. I am currently getting over the flu. I feel mostly back to normal with some still lingering symptoms. This was in part why I did not do a stream and thus did not have any videos out this past week for Christmas. I'm also on break, prompted by that. It was two different issues, one of them being the flu, the other one being some physical issues, let's say, like with my neck, some like tech neck issues. All of that just kind of leading me to having to take a break. And so right now I'm just doing this for the love, doing this for fun, just recording some thoughts down. Spoilers are going to come, though I'm not going to be super aggressive about them because I'm more so going to talk about what this film seems to represent and the conversation around it, rather than just going over the details of the film one by one. Regardless, if you don't want any spoilers, probably shouldn't listen ahead. I also will, be open to different opinions in the comment section. Essentially, my take is that I don't love the film. I think it is like kind of mid, kind of above average. When I first watched it, I felt like it was a 7 out of 10 movie. I thought it was like good. And I was watching it with my partner, Nelly, who I often bring up because she's not only my partner, but she's my partner in crime when it comes to the work that I do. Nelly did not enjoy it. Nelly did not enjoy it nearly as much as I did and found it actually quite frustrating for many of the things that I also found were, issues with the film. And so I adjusted it to more of a 6 out of 10 rating. And I want to explain why. I first of all want to say that with regards to filmmaking, I would say it's a well-made film in a lot of ways. There are some issues that I have with it. On the Pop Cultural Marxism podcast from the Brooklyn Institute, one of the critics reviewed it briefly in their recent episode and had similar concerns that I did, as far as the pacing of the film being off, as far as the film tackling numerous different themes and having all this kind of levity mixed with seriousness that at times put levity where there should have been more seriousness and seriousness where there should have been a bit more levity. An unevenness to the film, I think, does kind of plague it, especially when it comes to the themes. But there's no doubt that this is enjoyable as a film. It's exciting. It is well orchestrated in terms of especially its second half, the build up, the climax, the release, the chase, the tension. No pun intended with the chase, but Chase Infinity's character being under pursuit from authorities, having to escape to the sort of nunnery that's not really a nunnery but is actually an organized sort of hideout. All of that stuff is really fascinating. There are fascinating characters in it. I do have to agree with the many that have said that Benicio del Toro's character is really interesting, though I do have a bit of reservations about it. And I think that speaks to really the big problem that I have with the film. And it's not too different from what a lot of people were saying as it came out, which is the politics of the film. I know a lot of people seem to think that this kind of thing is separate from the merits of a film, from the merits of a piece of art, from the merits of an artist themselves. Separate the art from the artist. The politics are a separate category. Liking something for its politics in recent, decades has been seen as something that is even corny or poser-ish. But I think we're entering an era wherein that attitude is changing, because people are dying. People have always been dying, but as far as the global crises and their continuing elevation, their continuing escalation, as far as climate crises, refugee crises, as far as, pandemics ongoing, as far as all these different things, genocide, all of these different things that we're witnessing and having discourses about, and that are being brought to the table as far as celebrity discussions and art discussions, all of this stuff is going to shift people's perspectives a bit more and more towards wanting their artists to align with their values. And right now we're still in an era where people kind of see that as a bit off, especially people who kind of want to hold on to this particular era that preceded us, to a particular era wherein, we could kind of look past politics in a certain way and just judge things based off of, their artistic merit or just based off of, the content of one's character. I feel like people in the second Trump era with the rise of global fascism are kind of seeing the fraughtness of that concept. And that kind of brings me to One Battle After Another being a film that in its outset, or apparently so, is kind of trying to tackle the current moment, including the politics of it, including the sociological elements of it, in a way that gives gravitas to the moment, that speaks to what people are going through, that speaks to an ongoing struggle even. And in its attempt to do so, I think it reveals a lot of, complete falsehoods that kind of live in people's minds. And for the many people that adore this film, including like the folks at The Ringer, who I kind of I'm surprised, but I'm also not surprised that, Sean Fennessy and a couple other critics there said it was not only the best movie of the year, not only the best movie of the decade, but in fact is like the most important film in terms of what it speaks to in our cultural moment. And I just think that that's really funny because, first of all, we had a whole Sinners that came out earlier this year. I'll get to that. But to just address that in and of itself, I don't think that this speaks to the current moment very well at all. If it does so in a meta way that maybe it doesn't understand, because as I said, it kind of reveals that people don't really understand a lot of what goes on. And I think that that's especially encapsulated in the very controversial first 30 minutes of the movie, but also just the ongoing background plot that contextualizes the main character played by Leo DiCaprio, in which, he is this detonation specialist, this arms specialist. Years prior, the timing of this is very confusing because, it seems to be set now in like 2025 or in the 2020s for most of the movie, when Chase Infinity's character is a teenager in high school and Leo DiCaprio is a washed up former revolutionary. But when he was a revolutionary, he didn't look much younger, and it seemed to be like a lot of the technology and the clothing was not too distant from ours now. And Chase Infinity's character was born around that time, and it's giving she's 16 at the end of the movie. So really, it's like almost saying that this is happening like 2008. This early part of the movie and this revolutionary part of the movie, which is just really strange because the revolutionaries in question are some type of amalgamation of, clearly it's Black Panther influence, clearly Weather Underground, and a couple of other different organizations, including, as we see later on in the movie, kind of some social justice rhetoric kind of organizations. And one thing you'll know is that all of these types of organizations are very different. The Black Panthers were a Marxist organization that concentrated especially on economic sovereignty, building up, economic cooperation with impoverished peoples, Black and white, education. Of course, there were militant aspects of it, but the militant aspects of it were much more concentrated. Whereas in this movie, the revolutionaries are just engaging in a type of militancy, and it's given by the text essentially that this militancy is almost wanton, like it's almost just like pointless, it's almost like stupid. We never get really any up close and personal moments with the, for instance, prisoners that they set free. We never get to see any of the positive impacts that their activism does. All we see are these moments where, led by these Black Panther adjacent figures, Tiana Taylor's character and the other Black women, Jungle Pussy, other Black women that are part of the group, giving these kind of situationist monologues as they do these like robberies and these prison breakouts about their pussies, these monologues about their pussy power and about how, the man, whatever. It's stuff that feels very contrived and cliche, almost as if it's on purpose. I mean, if we're going to give Paul Thomas Anderson and the writers, all this credit for their filmmaking, then surely they're not deluded as to think that the stuff that they're talking about is, awash with depth and complexity. Essentially, what I'm saying is it gives this radical organizing a really bad rap, not understanding the differences between organizations. And somehow the organization lives on into the 2020s when Chase Infinity's character is in high school. And when Bob, the Leo DiCaprio character, tries to get back involved in order to orchestrate, her hideouts and all of that, he's talking to somebody on the phone, this old man who, we later find out he's an older man, who is using this social media, social justice adjacent rhetoric. At one point he says that after Leo DiCaprio yells at him and curses at him because he won't recite the password, essentially, the guy on the phone is like, you're giving me noise triggers. And it's so cringy. It's giving the kind of writing that, a 50-year-old, 60-year-old who doesn't care that much about politics would think of, current leftist messaging. There's not a really concerted, careful effort to understand what that rhetoric is about, even for the amount of critiques one might have of it. At the same time, it is kind of interesting that it comes from the mouth of an older person who, you can fill in blanks in the text and say, this older person who's on the phone using this social justice adjacent rhetoric, maybe he's a guy who doesn't really get it because he's a little older. He's trying to be hip like the kids. But you have to insert some stuff in the text to make certain parts of it work. And you have to kind of look past some things that the text is saying in order to also make other parts of it work. So another thing that, what I mean for that second part is going to, for instance, Benicio del Toro's character. Now, Benicio del Toro is essentially this leader of this Latino organized immigrant group. It's not really a group with a name. It's not really a group that we see has any formalization, but he has just this very regimented, very accurate, well-organized, intelligent coordination with tons of immigrants in the area, which is a sanctuary city. And it's so well done to the point where there are points where people think that they're going to get fucked, right? Like Leo DiCaprio's character gets apprehended, gets sent to the hospital, and the nurse bails him out because she's clearly in on the organization with Benicio del Toro, and when Benicio del Toro gets apprehended at the end, after bailing out Leo DiCaprio again and driving him off, he gets apprehended by police officers. And it seems like, as we get alluded to from the text, like the officers are also in on the coordination because they're not apprehending him like they would this kind of militant criminal who is working against law enforcement to take care of what would be called illegal immigrants. So there's all just this stuff in the movie that shows like Benicio del Toro's a badass. He's super calm, he's super focused, which is cool. And the organization that he's doing with the other Latinos to take care of the immigrants, to hide them out, to coordinate their movement, all of it is super well organized. And it's not to say that I think that that was a bad portrayal. I actually thought it was one of the strong points of the movie. It's also shot really beautifully. There's that scene where Leo DiCaprio goes into the bodega, I believe, and you see how, Benicio is kind of moving through it. It's like this long tracking shot where he's talking to one person, that person's moving over there, and there's one guy on his phone. They're like, get off your fucking phone. And then they go up the stairs and you see all these, mothers, these immigrant mothers holding their kids that are waiting. It's like beautifully shot. It's very captivating and it's very compelling, and it almost makes you look past how ultimately, especially by the end, you get a sense that these people aren't real. Like you get a sense that these people, even though they look so real, they some of the portrayal elements of them are quite compelling. They're like flawless, right? You don't get any sense from the immigrants that they make any mistakes. The immigrant folks are always getting out of trouble. They always know where to move, and it's almost like this kind of cliched, again, like older white guy who's not super into politics but might be left leaning. It's this cliched way that he might view immigrant organizations, people who take care of illegal immigrants, people who do that kind of movement, based on like bandito stereotypes in like the 80s and 90s almost. I don't know if I'm getting too deep there, but essentially what I'm saying is that the movie kind of fetishizes these immigrant groups a lot in this way that is almost especially and specifically done to contrast negatively with the American organizers who are so discombobulated, who are only in it for performative reasons, who, have to get bailed out numerous times, who, the Tiana Taylor character is forced to, non-consensually sleep with this military general in order to get out of trouble multiple times. There's just like this sense that these Americans, this American left, these American organizers, how all of them are like together, the Black Panthers and the Weather Underground, and also these different organizations that we've swept into this one organization, the French 75 or whatever, which still exists to this day in almost the same capacity. Whatever organization that is, I'd love to know whatever parallel that has with in real life, especially if it existed in the time period it's supposed to have in this movie, which would have been, again, like 16 years ago, so like 2009. Jesus. Regardless, like, it's a message that these folks are disorganized, and I think that that's just like a really negative testament to the work that the Black Panthers did, which has still had positive ripple effects to this day, and how so much of it was based off of real, practical, pragmatic organization, study, focus. It wasn't just rhetoric, it wasn't just jargon. And I know that a lot of people will say, well, okay, you're just being sentimental about the Black Panthers, it's something you care about a lot. I don't know why that's like weird. I think everybody should care about the Black Panthers. They're one of the most important organizations of all time. It seems like it's quite normalized, especially for white people, to think the Black Panthers are really cool and also not know anything about them. But the Black Panthers did all these different things, and where they had many flaws, and ultimately the organization was taken apart by the CIA, the Black Panthers did a lot of important good things that have left in positive, empowering ripple effects to this day, and they're worth being studied. And if you're going to critique them, don't do it by pretending like they were equivalent to the Weather Underground and a bunch of lazy, sloppy student organizers doing a bunch of bullshit. Right? And so this is the historical and political element that I think is pretty sour, pretty poorly thought out, pretty poorly researched, that is the undercurrent of the film. You know, that it seems to satirize and harshly critique 70s and 80s based leftist organizing and 60s based leftist organizing, maybe, as well as 2010s and 2020s slacktivism and online woke scolds or whatever, all into this one quite hastily thrown together package that reveals that the people reading it really didn't do much research about either of these dynamics. And to me, you know, that's a problem in and of itself, but you can kind of get away with, and this is the lens that I tried to watch the movie with as I moved on. I just tried to kind of like keep that as, you know, maybe perspective or maybe just like a necessary thing to propel the story. But even if you look at it as like, okay, this is important for the characterization of Bob, it's not really supposed to be accurate characterization of political stuff. That stuff really does matter because, you know, you have Bob, this character, this Leo DiCaprio character, who is this washed up revolutionary. And, you know, he's just messing up all over the place. He doesn't really understand much. And that character would be more compelling if he had come from this much more specified, drawn out place, wherein the revolutionaries that he had drawn from were clearly delineated as being very sloppy and undereducated, right? Maybe if also, you know, Bob had a more historically accurate, you know, leftist organizing base that he had come from, foundation that he had come from, maybe then Bob's character could still be this mess up, but ultimately it could speak not only to the French 75 group being helpful in its own way and contributive in its own way, but flawed, instead of just the Benicio del Toro-led immigration organization, you know, being this savior, right? It leads to that just like very black and white paradigmatic dynamic that, again, essentially is just like this self-satire by somebody who isn't the self. You know, he isn't the person that's being critiqued in the first place. He doesn't really seem to understand this dynamic. That's all putting aside, you know, the very kind of reckless attempts to do, you know, a self-critical and thoughtful examination of Black women and sexuality. It's ultimately reckless. It ultimately doesn't pay off. You ultimately have the Tiana Taylor character being entirely unsympathetic in my mind. I mean, there are points where you can see, you know, what she's struggling with, but you never get a great understanding of like, is she in it more for herself or is she in it more for the organization? Or is she in it more for her social connections? Is she in it more because of ideology? By the end, when she's written that letter to Chase Infinity and Chase Infinity's reading it out and getting all emotional, she's essentially just talking about how she did want to do the revolution and she messed up, which I just think makes her character so much flatter. You know, when you got to that point where she went into witness protection and then disappeared, right? And it fast forwards into the future. You know, I was getting a sense, especially with the runtime of this long ass movie, that you're going to get a lot more perspective on the older Tiana Taylor, reflecting on who she was, reflecting on herself, reflecting on the decisions she made, why she was so hypersexual, why she fetishized, you know, white men in a certain way for their gaze of sexualizing Black women, how she learned to love herself, you know, what she really thought of the revolution, all these different things that could have been taken on so that her character is given depth and meaning rather than having just been this complete, you know, crash out essentially for 30, 40, 50 minutes of the movie, who is just like constantly trying to make out with people and constantly slinging sex around and performing this like audacious. You know, Tiana Taylor mentioned Asada Shakur as an inspiration for this role in the movie, and I just think that's bizarre and tasteless because Asada Shakur is like not like this at all, right? You know, these Black Panther women were not at all like these hypersexual activists. They could not at all be characterized as people who were more interested in like feeding some type of hungry ghost sexual impulse by using revolution and violence as well as, you know, sexuality towards white men. Like that wasn't at all what Black Panther women were like. I mean, they were diverse, they were complicated, and often they carried the movement on their back through study, through legal expertise, through caring for others, through nurturing, sometimes through violence, right? So there's nothing really that like makes Tiana Taylor's character, Perfidia, like Asada Shakur in character.
I think the part that I feel like the mirror is her being unapologetically herself and standing up for what she believed in. I don't look at Perfidia and say this is Asada's life. Perfidia still has her own characteristics, and they stood for something. Unfortunately, Perfidia got a little greedy and it backfired on her, and she spiraled and made a few bad decisions. But one thing that we've seen in both is through all, they were badasses and they stood 10 toes down in what they stood for.
There's just not really a comparison there, especially because we never do get that characterization, that deeper look into her personality, that introspection, that more time spent with that character after she escapes witness protection. You just get her as like this lead in the first 30-40 minutes of the movie, and then she's nothing for the rest of the movie. She doesn't appear ever again. The only time you hear from her is in that letter. And I gotta say, this letter, like I've seen videos that are like explaining the ending of one battle after another. I've seen, commentary sometimes from my friends about this movie being so important in terms of its leftist messaging, in terms of its messaging about what we should be learning right now. But I gotta tell you, I really don't understand what the point of that is. I really don't understand how people got that takeaway when I saw that ending, because the ending letter that, Tiana Taylor sends to Chase Infinity's character, and Chase Infinity's reading aloud, is essentially like, I made my mistakes back in the day, I fucked up, we just wanted to change the world, we fucked up, but maybe you guys won't. And it's like, that's it? Me and Nelly were just sitting there kind of like baffled. I was almost just waiting for something to turn the other foot, or some sort of little hints to drop in there that suggests that this cheesy notion of the kids being the future and, each generation makes its mistakes would be nuanced in some sort of way to make me think more. But no, like that's just the message of the movie. The message of the movie is essentially just like, these older revolutionaries were stupid. They're holding on to the past. They don't really understand what they're doing. And that's only for the Americans. The immigrants, they get it. They get everything. They're super smart. They can essentially take care of themselves. If you think about it, it's kind of a pernicious way to look at it. Because instead of us having this mentality and as a takeaway from this movie of, we should be there in solidarity for our immigrants, brothers and sisters, we get this message of, despite us being fuck ups, the immigrants are so good at eluding the cops, at eluding La Migra, and they're so coordinated and smart that they don't need our help. In fact, they help us, which is just like that's what happens when you don't balance out the plot. I'm not even just talking from a historical, historicity standpoint. When you don't balance out the plot, you end up with this message about a specific group of people, just for the movie's sake alone, being this impregnable group of people with nobility in their hearts and, being able to take care of themselves perfectly well. And now when you stretch that out and you take it the way that these critics are telling you to take it, which is that this is so important, it's such an important film about our moment, it's about our moment. It's like, well, then you're saying that brown people in real life, the Mexican immigrants, the folks that are suffering at the hands of ICE, they're just taking care of themselves. They're so organized. They're so smart. They're so coordinated. It's us that are just falling apart because we want to be so performative. I just think this is the most retrogressive type of politics that you can have in an ostensibly left-leaning film, right? Which is itself a question. Leo DiCaprio has done some humanitarian work, but like, he's a Zionist. Paul Thomas Anderson, as far as I know, is a Zionist, or at least isn't really interested in, his taxpayer money going to slaughter folks in Palestine, right? These are folks who made the movie that don't really care about the Black Panthers at all, don't really care about revolutionary struggle at all, have never shown that, have never spoken about it, right? As opposed to someone like Ryan Coogler, who's directed Sinners, a movie that came out earlier this year and really gives you these nuanced and smart expressions of different characters. What Paul Thomas Anderson spends about 40-50 minutes in One Battle After Another telling us about, Latino immigrants suffering at the hands of ICE, but like coordinating and all of that. Ryan Coogler does in about 2-3 minutes with the scene from the indigenous folks who simply show up to warn a couple of white folks about this on the loose, right? And it's like, because we get so much less of the indigenous folks in Sinners, we have so many questions about them, right? All that we know is that, yeah, they showed up in a time where they could help others, they tried to help others, and then they moved calmly away when they saw that they did all that they can do. And one battle after another, you got these brown folks, you got these Latinos who are just, doing all that they possibly can over and over again to help this sad white guy with his performative politics politics. And, you know, there's a lot of physical comedy and a lot of goofiness that Leo really conveys. You know, he loves getting beat up in a movie. He loves having to do outlandish stuff with his body and all of that. And it makes you laugh, you know, when he's yelling, Viva Revolucion, and all this shit while he's just goofily running about, and all the Latino immigrant folks are just kind of chuckling and like supporting him and calling him a legend and all of that. It's like funny, it's interesting in certain ways, but it's also, again, just speaking to this dynamic where, okay, these people aren't real. Bob's character feels real, but he's been embedded in a context that doesn't feel real at all. And so he's just annoying in a lot of ways. You know, Bob's character is definitely somebody who exists in real life. There are definitely washed up revolutionaries. There are definitely folks who used to be with it a lot more and got burned out and had to escape, and who have turned to a lot of, you know, abuse of substances in order to cope. There's a lot of different versions of that guy, that white guy, right? But the fact that this revolutionary background is so inconceivable, you know, like it doesn't make sense for that to have existed in the 2000s. I know I keep harping on this, but again, the historicity matters when it comes to a film, because these films, especially when they're, again, supposed to tell us about ourselves and tell us about our moment, well, how could it possibly be telling us about ourselves when it's insisting that this Black Panther weather or underground type of organization existed in the 2000s when we were in peak neoliberalism? You know, around the time that Obama was going to get elected, you had this group running around, you know, breaking people out of prisons and wearing afros and talking about their pussies and shit like that, and Viva la Revolucion. Like, that doesn't jive at all with what we know about history, right? There's just so much about it that makes it completely unlike our existence, and there's nothing in the film that tells us, hey, this isn't like our existence. In fact, the whole thing about the movie, again, is that it's supposed to be telling us about our moment. And this is what I think maybe made people so hyped up about it, because I think it's what people were wanting, especially the people who aren't really excited about this shift, who feel jaded by this current moment, who felt jaded by Palestine activism. This movie is, yeah, the best movie of the year, the best movie of the decade, the best movie about our moment for folks who think the pandemic is over. I know I'm sounding pretentious as I say this. I don't really care. Like, in a couple of years, folks are going to look back and be like, damn, right? This movie was the movie of the moment for folks who believe in a two-state solution. This movie is the movie of our times for people who aren't interested in Black radical feminism. I don't know, you can go on and on, right? For folks who don't want to get invested in politics too much, who do think that political struggle is, you know, more or less a noble thing, but just also seems very wide-eyed and pretentious and useless, but still noble. You know, for people who like Rage Against the Machine, the general message of their songs, but think that they were a little bit tasteless and tacky. For people who like that kind of shit, right? Oh yeah, One Battle After Another really speaks to the moment. I think people were just desperate for a film that could seem to set out to talk about this moment, because nothing's been talking about this moment, okay? You know, even Sinners, to whatever degree you might love that movie, you know, it's much more of a movie about us through time, about time as something that is not just the Western conception, but something that is timeless. Time is something, you know, it's like Everything Everywhere All at Once too, like movies that are critiques of the concept of time in a certain way, that are about different universes, that are about how we connect to the past and the present and the future at the same time. They're movies about solidarity and ancestry. They're movies about the movement of the world, and it's many things that we don't understand. They're movies about spirituality, right? So they're not necessarily movies about ICE, right? They're not necessarily movies about Trump. They're not necessarily movies about the Black Panthers, which, again, Black Panthers 70s and 80s, but, you know, a topic of some interest now. They're not movies about Marxism. They're not movies about Palestine, right? One Battle After Another is like one of the only movies to come out this year, if the only one, that's actually portending to speak about this moment in time politically, this moment in time socially, trying to speak about, you know, leftist infighting and leftist histories, trying to speak about progressivism as a concept, trying to speak about our different flaws and how we negotiate them. And just because it's that, and just because Paul Thomas Anderson directed it and Leo DiCaprio's in it, and you got, you know, a diverse cast, I think white male critics who fit those descriptions I just made ate this thing up. You know, white female critics too. Like, it doesn't even have to be about race necessarily. I mean, I saw some leftists eat this thing up too. I think because the image that you have in your head of what this movie is a lot better than the actual movie itself, especially when it comes to its historicity and its presentness, right? as a film that is, is an action film and is a thriller and is fun, yeah, one battle after another, solid. A good watching experience in a lot of ways. Some really great shots in there. But as a film about, politics and historicity and solidarity and struggle, perhaps the biggest critique I could make of the movie is just mentioning what my dad thought about it. Because, and he probably won't watch this because I don't think he watches my videos, but my dad is, not necessarily progressive at all. My dad is a pretty laissez-faire, right-leaning guy in a lot of ways. And he watched this movie and he was like, I think it's about how people hold on to dumb notions of what the world should be like. But, I'll pull up the text. Some individuals, he says, some individuals do not evolve with time and keep looking for an ideal/dream. And like people who have voted Republican and who are pro-capitalist and all that stuff, saying things like that should tell you something, right? This is not exactly in the neatest definition of my dad's politics, but we don't have to get into that because you don't need to know about my dad. But that just kind of speaks to, I think, what the problem is. I hoped that this movie would be something that folks who are right-leaning might be able to watch and be, compelled to engage in the struggle because the film would address their concerns about the struggle and help them see the hope in it while also not neglecting the places for self-critique. But this movie doesn't do that. This movie, in fact, falls for the same kind of cliches that we see more reactionary liberals and even conservatives make about revolutionary movements, about radical movements, which is these people are just idealistic. They don't care about pragmatism. They're all spoiled and performative. And I don't think we need more of that. I don't think we need more people saying, oh, you progressives are so performative. Oh, you're so idealistic. I don't think that in a time period where the most idealistic people are far-right fascists who keep clinging to useless ideas of outdated American imperialism tactics and insane, aggressive, violent detention of anybody who can be considered a criminal threat, of labor camps and all such and so forth, of COVID denialism. And I don't think in this moment the idealists are the people who are like, hey, maybe we should distribute the wealth. Hey, maybe we should have universal health care. Hey, maybe we should stop getting into the affairs of other countries and starting wars so that we could take people's oil so that 1% of the country can have more yachts. I don't think that those are the people that would be idealistic. I don't think those are the people that are performative. I think that's actually the majority of people. And I think that's actually a very rational amount of people, or a very rational type of person. I think that that's a very popularizing notion. And I think when we get to 2-3 years from now, or maybe even a couple months, because the Oscars are coming up in a couple months, and this movie is set to do very well at them and probably win Best Picture. I don't even know if by that point people will already have had fatigue about the movie and some reservations about it. But if not, give it a year, give it 2-3 years. When the next pandemic comes back, because the bird flu continues to spread voraciously, continues to transfer to humans more and more, and is set to be another potential pandemic that we have even less recourse for than we did the last time. We have no preparation for it. We learned nothing from last time. We got worse at, mitigating disease. When we have even more economic collapse, when we have even more financial collapse, when we have even more austerity measures, when we have even more brutal repression of people, when we have even more war, I don't think people will look back on this movie and think, yeah, that movie really spoke to the moment. I think people will look back and think, wow, we were really the idealistic ones. That's my thoughts.